6.1%. That's the number that might unravel 70 years of how cars get built in North America. Not a crash, not a scandal, just a tariff rate that sounds boring until you realize what it actually unlocks. 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles flooding into Canada every single year. Priced so low they could force every other car maker to either slash their prices or watch customers walk away. This isn't a trade deal, it's a controlled demolition disguised as consumer relief. Canada just swapped decades of manufacturing power for cheaper canola exports and the promise of affordable EVs. The government calls it strategic realism. Critics call it industrial surrender. And here's what makes this terrifying. Once those 49,000 cars arrive and reset what Canadians think a car should cost, there's no going back. The price anchors shift. The supply chains crack. And the workers who built an entire industry get handed the bill. So stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly how a deal that sounds small on paper could trigger a collapse that reshapes the entire continent's auto future. Part 1. From protection to reversal, how Canada got here. Let's rewind to 2024. Canada wasn't messing around. The government slapped a 100% surtax on Chinese electric vehicles. That's double the price, right at the border. It was a massive wall designed to keep Chinese EVs out. Why? Because everyone knew what was coming. Chinese automakers like BYD weren't just competitive. They were building electric cars at price points that North American companies couldn't touch, subsidized by the state, backed by massive factories, designed to win on cost, not just features. So Canada joined the club. The US had already thrown up tariffs. Europe was tightening restrictions. The whole Western world was basically saying, we're not letting you undercut our entire auto industry just because you can build cheaper. It was protectionism, sure, but it was also survival. Because once you let a competitor reset the market price, you can't go back. Your own manufacturers either match it or die, and matching it often means cutting jobs, slashing wages, or just giving up entirely. For a while, it worked. Chinese EVs stayed out. Canadian and American automakers kept building. The supply chains that stretched across Ontario, Michigan, and the southern states kept humming. Tens of thousands of jobs stayed secure. It wasn't perfect, but it was stable. Then January 2026 happened. Canada didn't just lower the tariff, they reversed the entire policy. The 100% surtax? Gone. Replaced with a 6.1% most favored nation tariff. That's the standard rate you give to friendly trading partners. It's basically an open door. And it wasn't a quiet shift. This was formalized during Prime Minister Mark Carney's official visit to Beijing. Handshakes, press conferences, the whole diplomatic theater. The government had a story ready. They called it strategic realism. Translation, we're being realistic about what we can actually control, and we're choosing cheaper cars over a trade war. They talked about affordability, about giving Canadian families access to electric vehicles they could actually buy, about diversifying trade relationships after years of tension with China. But here's the tension they didn't talk about as much. This wasn't just about lowering tariffs. It was about trading leverage. See, tariffs aren't just economic tools. They're negotiating power. When you have a wall up, you control who gets through and at what price. You can demand things. You can set conditions. You have something the other side wants, and they have to play by your rules to get it. Canada just gave that up, and what did they get in return? We'll get to that. But the deeper question is this. Was the 100% surtax ever really about protection? Or was it always just a bargaining chip? Something to trade away when the pressure got too high? Because if it was the latter, then Canada never actually intended to keep Chinese EVs out. They were just setting up the exchange, manufacturing access for something else, something the government valued more. That's the part that should worry you. Because it means the auto industry was never the priority. It was the price. Part 2, the EV for canola bargain. Anatomy of the deal, okay? Let's crack this thing open and see what Canada actually agreed to. Because the details matter a lot. First, the EV side. Canada agreed to let 49,000 Chinese-made electric vehicles into the country every year. That's the initial quota. And critically, these cars get the 6.1% most favored nation tariff. That's the same rate Canada charges on imports from countries it has normal, friendly trade relationships with. It's essentially treating Chinese EVs like they're coming from a trusted partner, not a strategic competitor. 49,000 might not sound huge at first. Canada sells about 1.6 million cars a year total. So 49,000 is roughly 3% of the market. You might think, okay, that's a small slice, not a big deal. But here's why that math is misleading. Those 49,000 cars aren't spread evenly across every segment. They're electric vehicles, and they're going to be priced aggressively. We're talking about models aimed directly at price-sensitive buyers. The government set an explicit goal. They want 50% of those imports to be affordable models priced under 35,000 Canadian dollars within 5 years. 35,000 CAD. That's the threshold where a huge chunk of middle-class buyers start paying attention. That's the zone where people who've been waiting for EVs to get cheaper finally pull the trigger. And Chinese manufacturers are really good at hitting that price point. They've built entire business models around it. So those 49,000 cars aren't just 3% of the market. They're 3% aimed like a missile at the most price-sensitive, highest growth segment of the entire industry. And they're not stopping at 49,000. The quota is expected to grow by roughly 6% annually. By 2031, it hits 70,000 vehicles, and there's no reason to think it stops there. Once the infrastructure is in place, once the dealerships are set up, once consumers get used to the brands, expanding the quota gets easier and easier. Now, what did Canada get for this? Canola. Specifically, China agreed to slash tariffs on Canadian canola seed from approximately 85% down to 15% by March 1st, 2026. That's a massive drop. Canola is huge for Canadian agriculture, especially in the prairie provinces. It's a multi-billion-dollar export crop, and China had effectively locked Canadian canola out with those sky-high tariffs. So this deal reopens that market. It also lifts restrictions on other agricultural products, canola meal, lobsters, peas. For farmers and the provinces that depend on them, this is a big win, immediate, tangible. Saskatchewan's premier called it enormous progress. Billions in agricultural exports start flowing again. But here's the trade-off that defines the entire deal. Canada swapped manufacturing access for agricultural relief. They gave China a guaranteed foothold in the Canadian auto market in exchange for better terms on farm exports. And that tells you something crucial about how the government values these two sectors. Agriculture is treated as non-negotiable. Farmers need relief now, and the political cost of leaving them hung out to dry is too high. Manufacturing, on the other hand, is treated as flexible. The auto industry can adapt. It can compete. It can handle the pressure. That assumption might be wrong. Because here's the thing about giving up leverage in manufacturing. You can't get it back. Once those Chinese EVs are in the market, once consumers start buying them, once the price expectations reset, you can't just throw the tariffs back up without massive backlash. You've created a new normal, and the people who benefit from that new normal will fight to keep it. So the question is, did Canada just solve an agricultural crisis by creating an industrial one? Or is the government betting that the auto industry is strong enough to absorb this without collapsing? We're about to find out. Because 49,000 cars a year, priced to move, aimed at the most competitive segment of the market, with a quota that grows every year. That's not a test. That's a structural change. And structural changes don't reverse easily. Part 3. Competitive shock. What 49,000 vehicles really means. Let's talk about what actually happens when 49,000 aggressively priced Chinese electric vehicles hit the Canadian market. Because the government's framing makes it sound benign. More competition, lower prices, consumers win. What's not to like? Here's what's not to like. Price wars don't end cleanly. They end with casualties. Chinese EV manufacturers are entering this market with one goal: establish a foothold. They're not testing the waters. They're not exploring. They're coming in with vehicles designed to undercut everyone else on price, while still delivering the features that matter. Good range, decent interiors, solid tech. And they can do this because they've built supply chains and manufacturing processes that North American companies can't match on cost. Why? Scale, state backing, vertical integration. Chinese manufacturers control more of their own supply chains. They get subsidies and policy support that smooth out the rough edges. They can absorb short-term losses to win long-term market share. It's not a level playing field. It never was. And that's the whole point of tariffs, to level it artificially because the natural state is already tilted. Canada just removed that artificial leveling And now the legacy automakers, Ford, GM, Stellantis, the brands that have been building cars in North America for a century, have to respond. Ottawa is actually counting on this. They've explicitly said they expect legacy automakers to lower their prices under competitive strain. That's not speculation. That's the stated goal. The government wants Chinese EVs to force everyone else to cut prices so that Canadian consumers get cheaper cars. It's consumer-focused policy, not industry-focused. But here's the problem. When you force companies to lower prices, you also force them to lower costs. And where do costs get cut? Labor, suppliers, investment, margins shrink, dealerships feel the squeeze, financing gets tighter, the whole ecosystem starts tightening its belt, and the quota structure makes it worse. Because this isn't a free-for-all where Chinese companies have to fight for every sale. It's a guaranteed allocation, 49,000 vehicles every year, growing. That's a floor, not a ceiling. Chinese manufacturers know exactly how much volume they're getting. They can plan around it, build infrastructure, set up dealerships, establish service networks. They're not gambling, they're building. Meanwhile, the legacy automakers are looking at the same numbers and realizing they're about to lose 3% of the market, maybe more, to competitors who can price below them without sweating. So what do? They cut prices to compete, which means they cut costs to survive, which means jobs get reviewed, plants get evaluated, investment plans get reconsidered. And here's the scariest part. Once the price anchors reset, they don't bounce back. If Canadians get used to paying $35,000 for a solid electric vehicle, they're not going to suddenly accept paying $50,000 for a similar one from a legacy brand. The new baseline becomes the norm, and anyone who can't hit that baseline gets left behind. This isn't theory, it's how markets work. Price compression cascades. It flows through every layer of the industry, from the big manufacturers down to the suppliers making parts. From the dealerships selling cars to the banks financing them, everyone feels it, and once it starts, it's really hard to stop. So when the government says they expect competition to lower prices, what they're really saying is, we expect the entire industry to absorb a permanent reduction in revenue per vehicle, and we're betting they can do that without shedding too many jobs or gutting too much infrastructure. That's a big bet. And the workers in Ontario's auto plants, they're the ones holding the risk. Part 4. The Continental Fault Line, Canada, the US, and Industrial Trust. Now let's zoom out, because this deal doesn't stay in Canada. It radiates. The North American auto industry isn't separated by borders, it's integrated. A car assembled in Ontario might have parts from Michigan, electronics from Mexico, seats from Kentucky. The supply chains are continental. The factories depend on each other. The whole system is designed around that integration. So when Canada opens its doors to 49,000 Chinese EVs, it's not just a Canadian decision. It affects everyone. Ontario gets this immediately. The provincial government came out hard against the deal. Premier Doug Ford called it knee-jerk reaction that guts the domestic auto supply chain and risks relations with the United States. That's not subtle. That's a direct shot at the federal government. And it's coming from the province that builds most of Canada's cars. Why is Ontario so worried? Because they've seen this movie before. When one part of a continental supply chain gets undercut, the whole thing wobbles. If Chinese EVs start taking market share in Canada, the factories in Ontario that build competing vehicles start running below capacity. When that happens, layoffs start, investment dries up, suppliers lose contracts, and once a plant closes or a line shuts down, it doesn't come back easily. Meanwhile, Saskatchewan is thrilled. Premier Scott Moe called the deal enormous progress, and for Saskatchewan it is. Canola is their economy. Farmers there have been getting crushed by Chinese tariffs for years. This deal reopens billions of dollars in exports. It's immediate relief, tangible, real. So you've got one province celebrating and another one panicking. That's how you know the deal is unbalanced. The benefits are concentrated in agriculture. The risks are concentrated in manufacturing. And those two sectors don't overlap. The people who win and the people who lose aren't even in the same industries. But the real fault line is with the United States. President Trump said Prime Minister Carney was doing the right thing by seeking a deal. That's diplomatic cover. But his own US Trade Representative, Jameson Greer, called the move problematic and warned Canada would regret it. That's not diplomatic. That's a warning shot. Why does the US care? Because if Chinese EVs can enter Canada at a 6.1% tariff, what's stopping them from being assembled or finished in Canada and then shipped south under USMCA rules? Even if that's not the explicit plan right now, the infrastructure risk is real. Once Chinese manufacturers have a manufacturing presence in Canada, they're inside the continental system. They can start exploring loopholes. They can push boundaries. And the US is not going to tolerate that. They've spent years building walls to keep Chinese vehicles out. They're not going to let Canada become a backdoor. Labour groups in both countries see this clearly. Unions argue that trading long-term manufacturing leverage for short-term agricultural relief leaves Canadian industrial workers vulnerable. And they're not wrong, because once you lose manufacturing capacity, you don't just lose jobs. You lose skills, you lose supply chains, you lose the ability to build things domestically. And in a world where geopolitical tensions are rising and supply chains are fracturing, that's a national security risk, not just an economic one. So the US is watching closely. And if they think Canada is creating a loophole, they'll respond. Tariffs, countermeasures, trade barriers. The continental trust that makes the integrated auto industry work starts to crack. And that's the real danger. This deal doesn't just affect Canada. It destabilizes the entire North American industrial relationship. Because it breaks the implicit agreement. We all protect our manufacturing base together. We all keep China out together. We all maintain the integrated supply chain together. Canada just broke that agreement, and the consequences won't be limited to Canadian borders. Part 5. Jobs, wages, and the quiet human cost. Let's get specific about who actually pays for this. The government talks about affordability, cheaper cars for families, more options for consumers. That's the upside, and it's real. If you're someone who's been priced out of the EV market, 49,000 new affordable options sounds great, but there's a downside, and it doesn't show up in press releases. It shows up in plant closures, in layoffs, in towns that depend on auto manufacturing suddenly losing their anchor employer. Auto manufacturing isn't just assembly lines, it's a layered ecosystem. You've got the big plants where cars get built, then you've got the suppliers making parts, the logistics companies moving those parts, the tool and die shops maintaining the equipment, the engineering firms designing the next models, the service sector supporting all those workers, restaurants, housing, retail, schools. When an auto plant slows down, all of that feels it. And when a plant closes, entire communities collapse. Labour unions are sounding the alarm. They're saying this deal leaves Canadian industrial workers holding the bag, and they're pointing to a simple fact. Saskatchewan farmers get immediate relief. Ontario auto workers get uncertainty. The benefits are concentrated and fast. The costs are diffuse and slow. That's politically brilliant and economically brutal. Because when the costs hit, they'll be hard to trace back to this specific deal. A plant doesn't close the day the tariffs drop. It closes 2 years later when the company decides that running below capacity isn't sustainable. A supplier doesn't go under immediately. They slowly lose contracts until they can't make payroll. By the time the damage is visible, the deal will be old news, and the government will have moved on, but the workers won't have moved on. Because here's what happens when price compression hits manufacturing. Companies start looking for ways to cut costs. Labour is the biggest cost, so wages get reviewed. Benefits get negotiated down, hiring freezes kick in, overtime disappears, and here's the cruel part, the workers can't just move to agriculture. A laid-off auto worker in Oshawa can't become a canola farmer in Saskatchewan. The skills don't transfer, the geography doesn't work, the relief that agriculture gets doesn't help the people who lose manufacturing jobs, so you get a geographic and sectoral split. The prairies win, industrial Ontario loses, and the workers in the middle have no leverage because the deal is already done. There's also a bargaining power issue. When automakers are under price pressure, labour unions lose negotiating strength. Why? Because the company can point to the competition and say, "We can't afford your demands anymore. Chinese EVs are undercutting us. We need concessions or we close the plant." It's a race to the bottom disguised as market competition. And the workers are the ones racing. Now not everyone loses. Consumers who can afford to buy new cars benefit. They get more options and better prices. Agricultural exporters benefit. They get access to a massive market that was previously locked. But the industrial workers? They absorb the risk. They take the hit. And they don't get compensated for it because the government decided manufacturing leverage was worth less than agricultural relief. That's the quiet human cost. It doesn't show up in trade statistics, it doesn't make headlines, but it's real. And it's happening right now, because once the competitive pressure starts, the industry responds, and the response usually involves fewer jobs, lower wages, and less investment. The government is betting that won't happen. They're betting the industry is strong enough to compete without collapsing, but they're betting with other people's livelihoods, and if they're wrong, the workers pay the price. Part 6. The End Game. Question: strategic realism or strategic surrender? So here's where we land. The government has a plan. They're not just letting Chinese EVs in, they're hoping this opens the door to something bigger: Chinese investment, joint ventures, local manufacturing partnerships. The idea is that companies like BYD won't just export finished cars to Canada. They'll actually set up shop, build plants, create jobs, move from imports to domestic production. That would flip the script. Instead of losing manufacturing, Canada gains it. Instead of buying Chinese cars, Canadians start building them. That's the endgame the government is aiming for. Strategic realism means accepting short-term pain for long-term gain. Let the imports in, prove there's demand, then leverage that demand to attract investment and manufacturing capacity. It's not a crazy plan. It could work. If Chinese manufacturers see Canada as a gateway to North America, if they want to avoid future tariff risks by building locally, if they're willing to invest billions in new plants and infrastructure, then Canada comes out ahead. But here's the problem. None of that is guaranteed. There's no signed agreement requiring Chinese companies to build in Canada. There's no timeline. There's no minimum investment commitment. It's all based on expectations and hopes. And what if it doesn't happen? What if Chinese manufacturers are perfectly happy just exporting cars under the quota system? What if they see no reason to invest in Canadian manufacturing when they can just ship finished vehicles and avoid the hassle of building new plants? Then Canada gave up leverage for nothing. They traded protectionism for market access, got cheaper cars and agricultural relief, but lost the industrial bargaining power they had. Because once you let the imports in, once the quota is established, once consumers are hooked on the lower prices, you can't just reverse course. You can't throw the tariffs back up without massive political and economic backlash. Leverage only works when you haven't used it yet. Once you trade it away, it's gone. So the endgame question is this: did Canada trade time or control? If they traded time, then they're using this period to attract investment while managing the competitive pressure. They're playing a longer game. The short-term imports are a bridge to long-term domestic production. It's risky, but it could pay off. If they traded control, then they just gave up the ability to shape their own auto industry's future. The quotas will expand. The imports will keep coming, the price anchors will keep dropping, and Canadian manufacturing will slowly erode because it can't compete on cost with state-backed Chinese producers who have scale advantages and policy support. We don't know which one it is yet. That's what makes this so dangerous. The deal is done, the imports are starting, the agricultural relief is real. But the manufacturing side is still a gamble, and if the gamble fails, if Chinese companies never build significant manufacturing capacity in Canada, if the quotas just keep growing without any offsetting domestic investment, then this deal will be remembered as the moment Canada chose cheap cars over industrial sovereignty. Strategic realism or strategic surrender? The title asked if a 6.1% tariff could destabilize the North American auto industry overnight. The answer is, it won't be overnight. It'll be slow, it'll be quiet, plant by plant, job by job, contract by contract. But the mechanism is already in motion. 49,000 vehicles this year, 70,000 by 2031, growing annually, priced to compete, backed by manufacturers who can absorb losses and play the long game. And on the other side, legacy automakers under pressure to cut prices, which means cutting costs, which means cutting jobs, suppliers losing contracts, communities losing anchor employers, labour unions losing bargaining power. That's not collapse, it's erosion. And erosion is harder to see until the foundation cracks. So did Canada just reset the North American auto industry? We'll know in 5 years, maybe 10, when the quotas have expanded, when the investments either arrived or didn't, when the plants either adapted or closed. But the deal is done. The 6.1% tariff is locked in. The 49,000 vehicles are coming, and once you let that door open, closing it again is almost impossible.